Dust kicks up between the heavy woven tents of the Israelite camp in the wilderness of Sinai. Two men are locked in a violent, desperate struggle in the sand, tearing at each other's garments in the heat of the day. One man is a full-blooded Israelite. The other is a fracture in the genealogy. An Israelite mother, an Egyptian father. And in the middle of the blood and the shouting, the half-Egyptian son opens his mouth and speaks. The fighting stops cold. The men who were swinging their fists suddenly drop their hands. The crowd gathering around the brawl recoils, as if struck by a physical blow. Because the word this unnamed hybrid son just spoke is an utterance so paralyzing, so terrifying, that it forces the camp to drag him away and lock him in a dark holding cell until God himself breaks the silence. Let us read the King James Version verbatim from Leviticus chapter 24, verses 10 and 11. And the son of an Israelitish woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel. And this son of the Israelitish woman and a man of Israel strove together in the camp. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And they brought him unto Moses. Picture it. They drag this bleeding boy through the endless rows of tents. They bypass the lower judges. They bring him straight to the supreme authority of the desert. The canonical text gives us his mother's name, Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. But the son is left deliberately nameless, a ghost in the record. To understand what actually started the violence in the dirt that afternoon, we must look to the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. This is an ancient Aramaic translation and expansion of the Torah, read aloud in the early synagogues to give the congregation the full, unvarnished history behind the verses. The Targum tells us this fight was not about stolen silver. It was not about a spilled water skin. It was a dispute over the right to pitch a tent. The boy wanted to set up his dwelling within the tribe of Dan, claiming his tribal inheritance through his mother's blood. The Israelite man physically blocked his path, enforcing the strict patriarchal tribal law of the camp. Bloodline against bloodline. Rejected, publicly humiliated, and cast out of the only home he knew, the boy lashed out. He did not throw a stone. He used his tongue. We read blasphemed the name in our modern English and assume it was a common burst of profanity, a momentary, careless loss of temper. Read that again. The Hebrew text paints a much darker, much more dangerous picture. The word used for blaspheme is not a word of mere insult. It is a physical, destructive action. The men dragging him to Moses are visibly shaking because the boy did not just casually curse God. He actively pierced the sacred name. See the scene. Thousands of tents stretching toward the jagged horizon, and in the center of the camp, a sudden, suffocating quiet. Moses stands before the boy, listening to the witnesses repeat the syllables they heard. But Moses does not immediately command an execution. He hesitates. The great lawgiver of Sinai freezes. The word is spoken. The boy is bound, and the camp of Dan stands paralyzed in the wilderness dust. But the ancient Jewish records reveal that the horror of this violent rejection goes much deeper than a misplaced tent. Pulling a shadow straight out of the Egyptian sand, who was the nameless Egyptian father whose blood ran through this boy's veins? 40 years before this brawl in the wilderness, Moses buried a man in the Egyptian sand. Turn to Exodus chapter 2, verse 12. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Stop right there. We read that verse as the origin story of Moses, the deliverer. We assume the history of that dead Egyptian ends in the shallow grave, but the classical midrashic text, Leviticus Rabbah, brings that corpse back to haunt the camp. It records a terrifying genealogy. The Egyptian taskmaster that Moses struck down was not a random god. He was the man who violated Shelomith of the tribe of Dan. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record of the shadows moving beneath the biblical text. But if you read the verse through the lens of the Midrash, the tension in the camp explodes. The unnamed boy sitting in the dark holding cell the ward is the son of the man Moses murdered. Same blood, same violence. This explains the ferocity of the fight at the tents of Dan. The boy went to the judges of his mother's tribe, demanding his inheritance. The judges looked at his face, saw the ghost of the Egyptian taskmaster, and cast him out. He was a living reminder of 400 years of slavery. He did not belong to the camp. He belonged to the whip, to the mud, to the empire they had just escaped, reading, not inventing. Driven mad by the rejection, almost standing outside the circle of his own mother's family, he weaponizes the only thing he has left. He weaponizes the name. Look closely at Leviticus 24-11 again. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. Read that again. The English text adds the words of the Lord in italics, meaning they do not exist in the original Hebrew. The Hebrew simply reads that he blasphemed Hashem, the name, the tetragrammaton, the unutterable syllables of the Most High. Where did an Egyptian's son learn the precise pronunciation of the divine name? Some ancient traditions say he heard it at Mount Sinai, standing at the edges of the thunder. Others say he heard Moses himself speak it. Whatever the source, the boy unleashes it in the dirt. And Moses freezes. Watch what the text does. Moses, the man who speaks to God face to face, the man who brought down the stone tablets of absolute law, does not issue a sentence. He orders the boy locked away. Look at Leviticus 24-12. And they put him in ward, that the mind of the Lord might be shewed them. Sit with that. The law of Sinai was given to the children of Israel. This boy is a fracture in the covenant, a hybrid. A foreigner by patriarchal descent. Does the absolute penalty of the mountain apply to the blood of the Egyptian? Moses does not know. He locks the son in the ward. The entire camp sits in terrifying, suffocating silence, waiting for the sky to answer. One dead Egyptian, one hybrid son, and a camp waiting for an execution. But the true horror lies hidden inside the ancient Hebrew verb. What exact physical action does the text describe when it says he blasphemed the unutterable? The boy sits in the suffocating darkness of the ward. The violent heat of the Sinai day cools into desert night, and the camp of Israel remains paralyzed. Outside the tent of the holding cell, the men who fought him in the dust are trembling, because the crime they just witnessed is not a matter of a broken law, it is a physical tear in the fabric of their reality. Look closely at the English translation in Leviticus 24-11. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord. Stop right there. We hear the word blasphemed and our modern minds immediately reduce it to profanity. We imagine a careless insult shouted in the heat of anger, a man losing his temper and breaking the third commandment. Read that again. The King James English shields us from the violence of the original text. Turn the word blasphemed back into the ancient Hebrew. The word recorded in the scroll is nakab. It does not mean to insult. It means to bore a hole, to puncture, to strike through with a sharp instrument. Same word, different verse. Look at 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 9. But Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in the lid of it. That physical action driving a tool through solid wood is nakab. The half-Egyptian son did not simply use the Lord's name in vain. He took the unutterable tetragrammaton, the 4 sacred letters of the Most High, and he drove a spike through it with his tongue. He punctured the name. Picture it, a violent, bleeding outcast standing in the center of the camp of Dan, shouting the exact, hidden pronunciation of the Creator into the desert air. turning the holy into a weapon of pure spite. The Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin, preserves the terrifying legal threshold for this exact crime. The ancient rabbis recorded the strict parameters of the court. The text states clearly, "The blasphemer is not culpable unless he explicitly pronounces the name. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact." But the Jewish legal tradition requires absolute precision for a conviction. The witnesses could not simply say, "He cursed." To secure a judgment, the witnesses had to stand before the judges and repeat the exact blasphemy. They had to speak the pierced name out loud. When they did, the Mishnah records that the judges would stand on their feet and physically tear their garments, and those torn clothes could never be sewn back together. The tear was permanent. Reading, not inventing. The word nakab demanded a physical response. The men who dragged the boy to Moses are standing with their tunics ripped open, holding the weight of the syllables they were forced to hear. The camp is contaminated. The air itself feels fractured. Moses waits by the ward because the law of Sinai has no protocol for a hybrid sun puncturing the tetragrammaton. Then, the silence of the desert is finally broken. The Lord speaks directly to Moses, handing down a sentence that shifts the geography of the curse. But before the stones can be thrown, God commands the witnesses to perform a terrifying, intimate ritual with their own bodies. The voice of the Lord finally cuts through the quiet of the Sinai desert, speaking directly to Moses from the thick darkness of the tabernacle. There is no negotiation. There is only a terrifying set of physical instructions. Moses opens the door of the ward. The boy is brought out into the blinding sunlight, but he is not judged where he stands. He must be marched. Look at the precise command in Leviticus 24, verse 14. "Bring forth him that hath cursed without the camp, and let all that heard him lay their hands upon his head, and let all the congregation stone him." Stop right there. Notice the geography. Without the camp, the Israelite camp is a living, breathing architecture of holiness. God dwells in the center. The tribes radiate outward. Beyond the tents lies the wilderness, the realm of chaos, the outer darkness. The punctured name cannot remain in the sacred space. The half-Egyptian son has made himself a vessel of the curse, an infection in the center of Dan. He must be physically exiled from the sanctuary. Outside the camp, they walk him past the boundaries of the 12 tribes, out into the barren rock and sand. But before the congregation can execute the sentence, a chilling physical action is required of the witnesses. The men who fought him in the dust, the men who heard him pierce the tetragrammaton, are told to step forward. Let all that heard him lay their hands upon his head. We read that as a mere identification, a legal formality, pointing him out to the crowd and saying, "This is the man." But in the biblical world, laying hands on a head is never a casual identification. It is a literal, terrifying transfer of weight. Go back 8 chapters to Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. The high priest of Israel stands before the scapegoat. He places both of his hands firmly onto the head of the living animal, confessing all the iniquities of the children of Israel, physically transferring the sins of the nation onto the goat before sending it into the wilderness. Same desert, same gesture. I hold this as one reading, drawn from the strict legal mechanics of the sacrificial system, but the parallel in the text is unmistakable. The witnesses with the torn garments step forward in the dust. They raise their hands. They press their palms down onto the head of the boy. They are not simply pointing him out. They are taking the shattered, pierced syllables of the sacred name that entered their ears, and they are pushing the contamination back onto his flesh. See the scene. The boy stands alone in the wasteland, feeling the weight of the men's hands pressing down on his skull. He spoke the curse. Now he will carry it. The transfer is complete. The men step back, their garments torn, Their hands empty, the hands pull away, leaving the boy completely isolated, bearing the full weight of the pierced name in his own flesh. But the heavy stones the congregation holds in the background are not merely tools of execution, they are the ancient, brutal method of sealing an infection. What happens when an entire nation is commanded to bury the word they were never meant to hear? The hands pull away. The boy stands completely alone in the unforgiving light of the Sinai sun. The transfer is done. The men who fought him in the dust have backed away, their torn garments blowing in the wind, leaving him isolated with the full weight of the pierced name resting on his flesh. But before a single stone is thrown, Moses delivers the rest of the oracle. The judgment spoken in the dark of the tabernacle is not just about silencing one half Egyptian son. It establishes a terrifying precedent for the entire wilderness. Look at Leviticus 24, verse 16. And he that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well the stranger, as he that is born in the land, when he blasphemeth the name of the Lord, shall be put to death. Stop right there. As well the stranger. The Hebrew word used here is ger, the alien, the sojourner, the one dwelling among them without a native inheritance. The men of Dan had looked at this boy, saw the ghost of his Egyptian father, and told him he had no rights under the covenant. They used his foreign bloodline to cast him out of the tents. But God looks at that exact same Egyptian blood and dictates a chilling equality. You do not have to be an Israelite to be crushed by the weight of the name. The boy thought his fractured genealogy placed him outside the jurisdiction of Sinai. It did not. The God of the mountain is not a tribal deity bound by the borders of a camp. The law of the sacred tetragrammaton holds the stranger, the hybrid, and the native in the exact same absolute grip. One law, one weight. And because the law covers the entire camp, the execution must be carried out by the entire camp. Watch what the text does. It commands, all the congregation shall certainly stone him, not a designated executioner, not the tribal gods, the entire assembly. Picture it. Thousands of Israelites, men who hours earlier were paralyzed by the sound of the punctured name, now bending down into the wasteland dirt. They are wrapping their fingers around the jagged, heavy rocks of the desert. The command is absolute. The blasphemy polluted the air they breathe, so their own hands must cleanse it. Some ancient rabbinic commentaries suggest that stoning was not merely a primitive penalty, but a strict theological necessity. The sword sheds blood outward, but the stone crushes, buries, and covers. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but the physical act of heaping stones upon a man serves to drive the curse back into the dust from which humanity was formed. They are not just executing a man, they are building a tomb. But as the congregation raises their arms, the brutal reality of the rocks flying through the air forces us to ask a darker question about the boy's final moments. What happens to the pierced syllables of the tetragrammaton when the first stones finally make impact? The first heavy stone strikes the flesh, and the wilderness takes back the son of the Egyptian. Look at the final, brutal verse of the chapter. Leviticus 24, verse 23. And Moses spake to the children of Israel, that they should bring forth him that had cursed out of the camp, and stone him with stones. And the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses. Stop right there. Stone him with stones. It sounds like a repetitive translation in English, but the original Hebrew phrase, ragam ba eben, carries a heavy physical finality. They do not merely throw rocks from a distance to execute a criminal. They hurl them to cover him. They pile the earth on top of his shattered body until he disappears completely beneath the wasteland. Picture the mound rising in the dust, every man of the congregation adding his weight to the pile. Now, Cross-reference this rising mound of rocks with the ghost we pulled from the Midrash earlier. Turn back to Exodus chapter 2, when Moses struck down this boy's Egyptian father 40 years ago. What was the exact physical action Moses took to hide the body? He hid him in the sand. Same lawgiver, same bloodline. Moses buried the father in the soft, shifting sand of the Egyptian empire to cover up a murder in the dark. Now, 4 decades later, Moses commands the entire nation of Israel to bury the son under the jagged rocks of Sinai in the blinding light of the covenant. One was a secret buried by a fugitive. The other is a public quarantine commanded by God. The stones pile higher. And as they do, they are doing far more than breaking the bones of a half-Egyptian outcast. They are sealing a breached reality. Think back to the ritual of the hands. The witnesses pressed their palms onto the boy's skull, physically transferring the punctured syllables of the tetragrammaton onto his body. He became the living vessel of the nakab, the blasphemy. Therefore, the stones are not merely weapons of death. They are a spiritual quarantine. I hold this as one reading of the ancient ritual logic, but the physical reality is undeniable. The rocks are dropped to ensure the corrupted breath never escapes back into the sacred camp. The stone crushes the throat. The dust chokes the pierced word. The heavy weight of the Sinai rock seals the contamination beneath the earth. The execution ends. The air settles. The congregation drops their final stones and dusts off their empty hands. The absolute law of the stranger has been satisfied. The men of Israel turn their backs on the violent mound of rocks and begin the long, quiet walk back toward the tabernacle. But as the crowd disperses and the camp of Dan returns to their tents, the true psychological toll of this execution remains hidden in the biblical text, because one figure has been completely silent through the brawl, the arrest, the ward, and the stoning the Israelite woman, whose blood tied this boy to the camp. What terrifying irony is buried in the translation of the mother's name? The dust settles over the mound of rocks in the outer wasteland. The men of Israel wash the dirt from their hands, re-enter the boundaries of the camp, and return to their fires. But inside the tents of Dan, one woman sits entirely alone in the wreckage of her bloodline. Look closely at the single verse that anchors her existence in the biblical record. Leviticus 24, verse 11. And the Israelitish woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord, and cursed. And they brought him unto Moses. And his mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Stop right there. The biblical author deliberately erases the name of the Egyptian father. The text deliberately erases the name of the blaspheming son. They are wiped from the eternal record, reduced to anonymous shadows in the sand. But the mother is named fully: lineage, father, and tribe. Why? Turn the English back into the ancient Hebrew, and the tragedy of this family is carved directly into their names. The mother's name is Shelomith. It is derived from the root shalom, peace, wholeness, completeness. She is the daughter of Dibri. That name is rooted in the Hebrew word davar, the word, the speech, the utterance. Read that again. Her entire identity in the Hebrew text translates to peace, the daughter of the spoken word. Sit with that. The bitter, suffocating irony is staggering. This woman, whose very name prophesied peace, coming from the spoken word, gives birth to a son who does the exact, violent opposite. He weaponizes the spoken word to destroy the peace of the camp. He uses the breath of his lungs to utter the nakab, the piercing of the divine name. Same tent, same breath, entirely different destinies. In the ancient Near Eastern world, davar is not just communication. Davar is a physical force. When God created the heavens and the earth, He did not build them with his hands. He used davar. He spoke them into existence. Speech is the mechanism of reality. Therefore, when the half-Egyptian son of Shelomith uses his speech to puncture the tetragrammaton, he is not just breaking a moral code. He is actively attempting to unravel the fabric of creation itself. He took the legacy of his grandfather, Dibri the word, and turned it into a blade. The classical commentaries in Leviticus Rabbah suggest that Shelomith was a woman of good standing, a tragic victim of the brutal Egyptian taskmaster 40 years earlier. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But if true, it deepens the horror of the narrative. She survived the whips of the empire. She survived the drowning waters of the Red Sea. She made it all the way to the sanctuary of the Sinai desert, only to watch the ghost of Egypt rise up in her own son and destroy him from the inside out. Picture it. She watches the men of her own tribe, her own brothers and cousins, drag her boy into the holding cell. She watches them march him past her tent, out into the barren rock. She hears the heavy, dull thud of the stones echoing across the valley. Peace, the daughter of the word, left sitting in absolute silence. But as the night falls over the camp of Dan, and the wilderness wind blows over the unmarked mound of rocks, we must ask what this means for the men who actually threw the stones. The son is dead, but the memory of the pierced name is still ringing in the ears of the witnesses. What happens to a camp that now knows exactly how heavy the syllables of the divine name really are? Go back now to the dust kicking up between the heavy woven tents of Sinai. Two men locked in a desperate struggle in the heat of the day. You have read this brawl in Leviticus 24 a dozen times, assuming it was just another camp dispute, a sudden, careless loss of temper in the wilderness. But tonight, that image holds a different weight. It is not just a fight over a tent. It is a collision of ancient bloodlines. It is the ghost of a dead Egyptian taskmaster, returning from the sand to haunt the lawgiver who buried him 40 years earlier. When the fighting stops cold, and the half-Egyptian son opens his mouth to speak, you now know exactly what tore through the air. He did not merely curse. He used the ancient, violent weapon of the nakab. He took the 4 unutterable letters of the tetragrammaton, the sacred syllables that hold the universe together, and he drove a spike through them with his tongue. Picture it. Thousands of Israelites standing paralyzed in the blinding sun. We know now why Moses froze. We know why the camp of Dan could not simply stone him where he stood, and why the dark, suffocating isolation of the ward was required. God himself had to step out of the silence, to declare that the absolute law of the mountain crushes the native and the stranger with the exact same terrifying force. Read the final verdict again in Leviticus 24-15. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, Whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin. Carry it. A physical, crushing load. We know why the witnesses were commanded to press their hands onto his skull. They were not pointing him out. They were transferring the physical contamination of the pierced name back into his flesh, mirroring the Azazel goat walking into the wasteland. I hold this as one reading of the ancient records, not the final word, but the execution only resolved the physical breach in the camp. The heavy stones of Sinai silenced the tongue of the sun and finally buried the ghost of the Egyptian father. Yet, a fraction of the mystery still breathes in the dark. The men who dragged him to Moses, the men whose tunics were permanently torn by the judges when the words were repeated, could never mend their garments. They had to live the rest of their lives, wearing the physical evidence of the blasphemy. Same desert, same torn clothes. They survived the wilderness, but they never forgot the sound. The boy is buried under the rocks, but the desert is still holding the memory of what he said. If you made it to the end of this journey, comment the word "watched" below so I know who is traveling these ancient paths with me. Subscribe to the channel to keep unearthing the lost context of our biblical text, and send this to one person who loves deep Hebrew word studies, but has never heard the true story of the boy taken outside the camp. The name was never meant to be a weapon.